You're live.
Hey, thank you. Well, we'll get started. Thanks everyone for joining me today. So we've taken the roll call off, so we don't have to do that. So we'll start with the approval of minutes from our July meeting. I know those went out only this morning, but does anyone have any comments, changes, or had a chance to look at them?
They look good.
They look good to me.
Yeah.
Nobody has any issues?
Motion to approve.
All right, we need a second.
Second?
Okay, I'll take a show of hands in favor. Okay, looks good. For some reason I left new business on here at the top, but we'll skip that one and go to old business. So the first is the Kiowa Landscaping Work Group, and I don't have anything new to report on that. Same with the Shorebird Stewardship. So flood mitigation and sea level rise. I didn't know if either Jim or John wanted to, maybe briefly update on, the status of their, adaptive management group is right now and kind of where they're at. Just a real quick update if you don't mind.
Jim, Jack, you want to say anything?
Turn it over to Jim. Go for it, John.
The task force, the Kika task force, which is also working for the town. We held 2 focus group sessions where we had, I guess, about 32 people all told. Get together for a while and talk about issues that they were worried about regarding flooding, climate change, sea level rise. And from the comments that they had, their concerns, the group put together a survey, a series of questions that will be going out electronically in a week or two to every property owner to assess how the community at large views these concerns. In the meantime, there have been private interviews with Mayor Weaver, with the Kiowa partners, with the resort, and with the conservancy. There was also a survey that went out to commercial entities, a total of 78 realtors and rental companies and property managers to try to find out what their views were and what they hear from their customers in terms of concerns. Those interviews and that survey will probably all go into the report for November, start of November. And, but will be in addition to the results of the survey. And so that's, I guess, how the progress we've made so far. Jack, Jim, and Dave are all parts of that group. If they have anything else to add.
I'd just add that I think we're making good progress. The whole purpose of this exercise is to get the adaptive management process institutionalized inside of mainly Kika and the town. And the first step of that is to define the thresholds that the community does not want to see happen to pass related to sea level rise and climate change. And we think we're on track to get a report back to the town and Kika with those recommended thresholds. And we expect that they will accept, endorse those, and start the generation of the formal adaptive management plan. Next steps then would be trigger points. Professionals probably from Kika in the town would design those trigger points that would tell you when you're approaching the thresholds, and they would start putting in place adaptive management plans, which in the case of threshold is the trigger point is reached, then that would be what you would do to keep from hitting the threshold. And of course, they can change those all the way up to the time a trigger point is actually hit. So I think we're making good progress toward that goal.
The only thing I would add is watch for the survey hitting your inboxes, hopefully at the end of next week. And you'll have a couple of weeks to answer it. And hopefully everyone here will jump in. And I wanted to thank the couple of people here who participated in our virtual focus groups as well. So thanks.
Okay, great. Great update. That all sounds really good. We'll move to Parkway landscaping now, and I'll just give you a quick update on that. I'm sure you've noticed we're finally done with the repaving and restriping and all the associated work with the Parkway. And so the next phase is to get our landscaping in. We've had a few delays on that. At this point, it looks like plants will start, well, site prep will start later this month. Plants will start going in the ground in October, and we should have it wrapped up hopefully by the end of November, maybe slightly into December. So a little bit behind schedule, but may give us some benefits in that we're putting in a lot of these plants after the weather cools down a little bit, so irrigation issues won't be as big of a deal. We should get higher plant survival. So look for that work to start soon. Next is what seems like 99% of what I've been working on lately, which is the rodenticides and wildlife issue. And so we're going to come back to this in new business a little bit, but I'll just give kind of a quick update. I'm sure everyone has probably been following the news and the e-blast and has seen, all that's transpired on this issue in the last 2 months. So I won't go back over a lot of it, but I will kind of bring you up to speed on some stuff you may not be aware of. And then again, we'll come back to it here in just a few minutes. So obviously, we all know what the issue is, the impacts it's having on our bobcats. The fact that the town can't legally pass an ordinance to regulate the use of any rodenticide or any pesticide. And I'm sure you all also know that, we as the town, along with the Conservancy and the Community Association, had requested a temporary ban from the Department of Pesticide Regulation, which we sent in July. That was denied in August. So basically the DPR's position was that these voluntary efforts by the pest control industry, as well as individual property owners, are reducing the amount of SGAs in the environment, and that there's no need at this time to have any sort of a regulation, be it temporary or otherwise. So that came about a few weeks ago. And so we're kind of working on where do we go now? And I want to just, briefly touch on, the things that we're focusing on now, which are, this voluntary effort to reduce the use of SGAs and actually all anticoagulant rodenticides. So, I think our initial messaging, focused on the second generation ones, but some additional research has shown us that the first generation ones, one in particular, can have, pretty serious, negative impacts to wildlife. And so, we're now recommending that folks don't use any sort of an anticoagulant, be it first or second generation. And so I'm sure you've all seen. Lynn, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah. Are there any companies, Jim, that are refusing to stop using these chemicals?
That's a good question. And we'll get to that. Well, actually, we'll go ahead and touch on that now. So let me I'm gonna real quick share my screen so that you can see. So I was about to get into the, the Bobcat Guardian program, which, the town kicked off and wanted to, and obviously we're, if you sign that pledge, you're saying you're not going to utilize any second generation anticoagulant. So hopefully you can see these numbers. You may not be able to see. Well, that didn't work exactly right. But anyway, so in terms of pest control providers, our business license records would indicate that we have 79 companies that do work on Kiowa. And now not all of those do rodent work, but the vast majority of them do. So at this point, we've had 21 companies pledge not to use SGAs. And so that's about 27 or so % of the total number of providers. And I'll just quickly, run through, for regimes, we've got about 58% of regimes signed up, 21% of rental property management companies. All of our island entities are on board. As far as property owners, so individual properties, we've got 564 individuals or households who have pledged. We've got that out of the total number of residential properties, but I think some of those may be undeveloped. So, this 13% figure may not be, exactly what the percent of developed properties is. But that's kind of where we're at in terms of numbers. And so back to Lynn's question of, have there been any companies that have flat out said, no, we're not going to change? Not really. But we've got a lot of companies that haven't signed up and certainly should have seen the messaging. They've been reached out to multiple times. There's some big name companies that still haven't taken the pledge. And that's one thing that I wanted to talk about under new business when we get to this idea of a rodenticide subcommittee. I guess I would envision a group like that basically helping our messaging to pest control companies, potentially reaching out to pest control companies, on a personal level. In a perfect world, maybe, having friends or neighbors who utilize a certain pest control company that hasn't taken the pledge, and then having them reach out. So just other ways to get to these companies other than the town sending emails, might be more effective at reaching some of those companies. But we can talk about that in just a minute. So the other things, does anybody have any questions at this point or anything else you want? Okay.
Do you know what proportion of business on the island those companies do? For instance, if the few that signed up account for 80% of all the business, that'd be significant. Not all companies are going to be equal, have the business divided equally.
That's very true. We have some information on that. So I have looked at, so if you have a business license with the town, you have to report income. The price of the cost of your license is based on your income actually from the prior year. And so while our records are not complete, and some companies probably underreport or, the income reported isn't 100% accurate, I basically pulled the top 10, basically the top 10 pest control companies in terms of income. And we've got almost all of those. So the ones with the largest footprint we do have, which is good and helpful. But, at the end of the day, if you still have, 40 companies out there that might only be servicing 10 properties, you still could have a pretty big cumulative impact just with some of the smaller companies. So yeah, we're trying to to also work with the industry, the Pest Control Association, as well as the DPR to get more accurate numbers on, number of clients that these individuals have, number of properties on the island they're servicing. We've also asked and have been promised that they would attempt to gather this data, is basically the historical use of SGAs by individual companies as well as the current usage. So pest control companies, they have to be licensed through the DPR to utilize these products. They have to keep records. They have to keep those records for 3 years. And those records are available to be audited by the DPR if they so choose. So, we're hoping that will also help us out. If we can see which companies were historically using these products and if they've changed or not, that will be helpful information as well. So kind of the next step, as we work through all of those things is, basically the DPR's letter and some subsequent, conversations have suggested that if the issue doesn't get better, in other words, if the amount of SGAs on Kiowa and the negative impacts we're seeing to wildlife doesn't improve, that DPR would potentially reconsider or would consider, placing a ban in place or a prohibition in place. And so DPR, as well as the town, have an interest in trying to develop some sort of research project to look at SGAs in particular, but all anticoagulants in the environment. So while, obviously the best way to figure out if these voluntary programs are working would be if you had, the records from all these companies of when they used them prior to the voluntary efforts and now after. And so we're working on that, but that's a little bit of a challenge. So, then the idea is, okay, well, is there a way to track it in wildlife, so that we can look at changes and improvements over time. And so we started conversations about a pilot research project, which would basically test a variety of animal species in the hopes of coming up with a good sentinel or indicator species for SGAs in the environment. And so initially the idea, and it's changed a little bit and is still uncertain exactly what this research project will look like. The original idea was to basically test, collect and test the livers of a variety of rodents as well as raccoons and possums to see if you can, if SGAs do accumulate in those species, can you catch them and can you, identify those compounds in them. But to do to figure that out, you would need an area where SGAs are currently being used. And so the initial idea was to find a study site, potentially on Seabrook, where there are some companies that are still using SGAs, and then collect those animals and then, look at SGAs in their livers and try to get some initial information on, coming up with a good animal basically to test on Kiowa going forward to look at changes in the amount of SGAs out there. And so that research project was going to be jointly funded by DPR and the town, at least the initial work. But it went through a couple of drafts and then ultimately kind of got changed a little bit by DPR, and they decided to fund it all and went a direction I wasn't real comfortable with. And so expressed my concerns, and where we're at now is that DPR is talking with a variety of other researchers and experts and developing, what they're calling a research team to try to design this project. So they kind of went back to square one a little bit So they brought in a couple of biologists from DNR, as well as a couple of professors at Clemson. And I believe they had a meeting last week, and they've got another one this week. And so I don't know what this new research project will look like, but you know, it's something we should have more information on here in the next few weeks. Anyone have any comments, thoughts, other ideas? All right. So we'll move on, and then again we'll talk about this here again in just a minute. So next is deer management. Nothing new to report there. You know, we're still planning to harvest 100 deer this fall and winter. Don't know exactly when that'll start. Probably November or December. We've also got our fall deer surveys coming up in October. So we'll see what our numbers look like. But based on what I'm seeing, and probably a lot of y'all are seeing the same thing, I've never seen so many fawns on this island in my 25 years. You know, every doe has a fawn, just about. Most of them have two. You know, I think we've had 10 or 12 fawns hit by cars and killed in the last 6 weeks, which is, you know, incredibly high. So, you know, clearly fawn survival is higher than it's been in a long time. And so we're likely going to see numbers this year that are even higher than last year, which were already, you know, almost double our, you know, historic number for the last 10 or 15 years.
Jim, can I ask a question? There's a concern in at least one part of the island where certain people feed the deer, and that some of these large bucks are trying to come up to people as they try to walk to the beach. Is there some kind of ruling that you can't feed the deer on the island, or what can these people do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've heard a few of those. I've seen some pictures and videos of people hand feeding deer and petting deer, especially on the west end of the island, West Beach area. Mm-hmm. We don't have an ordinance against feeding of wildlife on Kiowa. So technically you can. Obviously we, you know, discourage feeding of deer. You know, it's no good can come from that. You know, not only are you, you know, potentially in a lot of cases, you know, artificially increasing, you know, the carrying capacity of an area by feeding these animals, you know, you're also concentrating them in an area where diseases and other things can play a role. Not to mention that when you feed them, they get more used to people, and potentially you can have a negative interaction, even though that's, you know, it's pretty rare for that to happen, incredibly rare. But it does happen. And so, you know, there, other than, you know, encouraging folks not to feed deer, don't approach deer, don't pet deer, you know, there's not a whole lot we can do other than, you know, reduce the numbers of deer and hopefully get things back in balance. Okay. So that's the plan. Anything else on deer? All right. Last under old business, I put on the, you know, for the Kiowa Conservancy project update. And Lee, I know you're gonna, you know, talk about the new funding proposals here in just a minute, which are, you know, for the most part, second phases of the initial projects. So I don't know if you would prefer to give us a quick update on this year's research and where we're at, and then talk about the new stuff. That's probably the easiest.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, no, I'll be brief. So I'll talk about the groundwater project first. So I think back at our last meeting, we had about 15 wells installed, and we were working on getting everything set up to install additional wells. Since then, we've installed 6 additional wells, 4 on Kika property and 2 on residential properties out near Surf Song and on Ocean Course Drive out in Ocean Park. So right now we're sitting at 21 wells, with most of them being deployed with level loggers. So they're gathering information now. So we'll end up getting all that information in seasonally. So we'll probably take all the level loggers out at one point, download all the data, kind of see where it kind of leads us. But the idea is to gather this seasonal data over time and being able to report it out later. There are some potential other sites for wells, but there's still ongoing discussions about that and everything. But for the most part, everything looks good on that end. For the marsh project, we've been talking closely with the college and getting notes about their progression. And one of the things that they were able to do within the last few weeks was to share with us a web layer, which would be able to allow anybody on this committee to look at the shorelines and being able to compare them back and forth. And I'm more than happy to share that with y'all. But for the most part, it only has about 4 shorelines because of the rendering rates for it. But it's between the ranges of 1994 and 2019 with the most updated imagery. And you can toggle on and off imagery to actually see the physical changes over time. They should be able to package all that information once they get the final, completion of all the data sets and getting it ready for actual doing the AMBER study, which is looking at the physical changes of shorelines and mapping that out. So for the phase 1 projects, they're very close to completion. And I feel strongly that we're going to finish them up by the end of 2020.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Anybody have any questions for Lee on that? Okay. So we'll move to new business. And so the first is the idea of a rodenticide subcommittee, or something along those lines. And so, we got a lot of smart people in this meeting right now. And so, I guess I'm asking for help and, better ideas, better ways to approach pest control companies, other ideas of how we, attempt to deal with this rodenticide issue. And so, or if anyone wants to, participate in this subcommittee, chair the subcommittee, if you even think it's a good idea. So I'm going to open it up to y'all, and hopefully someone will have some comments.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And that's one of the things we spent a lot of time this morning talking about, because we have that ad hoc subcommittee of my environmental science committee. And they've been working extremely hard. So I'd be happy to help you with that subcommittee. And there might be a couple of people on that committee that would be very willing to help, because they've done a lot of research on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that group has done a lot of work, and that, I think in my mind, this group's job would be to partner with the Conservancies group, and kind of split the workload, especially if we're talking about, contacting companies directly, contacting neighbors, whatever the strategy might be. It's just to, what we've seen with, when we rolled out this Guardian program, a month ago, we did a lot of messaging around it, e-blast and social media, and we had a lot of signups, but in the last 2 weeks, no one's signing up anymore. It's kind of lost its momentum, if you will. And while we'll continue to push it as much as we can, I think looking at alternative ways to tackle this issue is important. Go ahead, Jim. We can't hear you though.
I had mute on, I'm sorry. What are the people in Clemson, how do they respond when only 20% of the pest control companies have agreed to participate? their argument for not giving us the temporary was they thought that our initiative was going to be successful. When we go back to them and tell them that only 20% of the pest control companies are cooperating, doesn't that change what they do?
Yeah, I
Why do
mean,
we have to do science when they have such a simple solution? I mean, they can put in the temporary. We tried, it didn't work. But
Yeah, I
do what
think-
they should do.
yeah, you know, I feel your pain. So their response is, and it's kind of along, you know, what Mr. Leffler alluded to earlier. You know, they're basically saying that even though there aren't that many companies that have pledged, the ones with the biggest footprint have pledged. And while we haven't seen any data or numbers or documentation, they are saying that 80 to 85% of the residential accounts on Kiowa, you know, are handled by, let's say 8 or 10 companies, and those companies are on board. So their stance is we've already reduced the residential use by 80%. And so, you know, we've come a long way and made a big difference. Now, we don't have any data that's to support that or anything, you know, other than what we're being told by the South Carolina Pest Control Association. And that's who's driving a lot of this, you know, or providing a lot of this information.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so.
One
I
question,
think, you know, and I think just to follow up, I think your initiative is a good one, and I certainly would be willing to help, but I think working closely with the Conservancy task group on this is the right thing to do, because I think if we can identify the companies, other significant companies that haven't cooperated, personal outreach. I mean, we have lists, for example, in the preserve, we have an email list of everyone in the preserve. We can just ask who in the preserve is still using, people who are using these prohibited materials, and how do we get to them? How do we contact them? How do their customers tell them they don't want them to use it?
Right. No, I agree. I mean, you know, a grassroots approach to any problem can be very effective, and a personal, you know, if I were to call up a company and talk to them about it, you know, they would probably listen, but, you know, if 5 customers call and, you know, request that they consider signing this pledge, or, you know, state an issue that they have, then they're probably more likely to make a change. So
Exactly.
Jim,
yes.
can you provide the list of the companies that to us that are the pesticide companies that are on the island?
Yes.
Okay.
quick,
And should be able to provide phone numbers
Okay.
and other contact information, though I'm not 100% sure exactly how we would work that, but it should not be a problem.
Okay.
And so, so I have Jane who's volunteered to help.
Well, I'm going to volunteer Jim.
Yeah. I'd help you with it too, Jane. I like the whole concept, and I like putting the two Conservancy group and this group together, because why reinvent the wheel? You've probably already done so much
There's a
research
lot.
on this.
You've got a lot of research there.
I'm also willing to help. I just had to mute because I had a lawnmower going by.
Wonderful. Hey, we've already got the plastics committee.
I know, I was just thinking about that. I was like, you know, y'all handled a lot of the heavy lifting on, you know, visiting companies on the plastics issue and seeing what they were using. And, you know, that information was incredibly valuable to our efforts. And so,
I see.
you know, I think we have
down
another
there.
opportunity here.
Yeah, Scott's over here somewhere.
Jane, with your discussions in the Conservancy, do you have some ideas of other approaches to take or how to go about doing it?
We have some ideas. The ad hoc committee has put together an enormous amount of material and different ways to use IPM with different, integrated pest management and ways that you can protect your house without using any pesticides or at all. They're coming up with a list of things that we're going to put on our website that you can do. And they've done so much research on each one of these different the pesticides themselves, and which seems to be the less of the problem, cause the less problem, the least problems. And they've got even a chart that has all this information and provided 2 documents to us that we accepted and approved of at our last meeting of the previous meeting. But we also now voted to approve a position statement, Jim, against the use of all anticoagulants. I changed that. That was something we voted on our environmental science meeting last week. So that has been passed by the executive board, and then it will go to the full board of trustees next week. So there's been a lot of background, and it would be great for somebody on that committee to give an update of what they've done. If you're interested in working, then we could get Jim Gillum to just give a summary and pass off some of the documents that we have.
So perhaps the Conservancy would be undertaking a major education effort?
Yes, that's what we have.
Mailings and
That's what we talked about a lot. I think we spent, how long did we spend on that today, Lee? Lee, 35, 40 minutes talking just about the rodenticide issue and the problems that we're seeing and what we can do.
Yeah.
Since we can't have conservation matters and things like that in person, I wonder if you could sponsor a virtual program where you have some folks from the Conservancy or some other experts put on an education program.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We had a learning with Lee, with Jim Jordan earlier, but we're talking about some more things like that, that conservation matters is a good idea. Lee, you can talk to Jennifer and Cindy. We can talk to them about that too.
Yeah, certainly.
Well, and repetition is what it takes to, really get the message out over and over again.
Yeah. Well, Lee, do you want to say anything about this too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that with the position paper and everything, I think that there's been a lot of cohesion between the town and Conservancy on this, and I'm more than happy to serve on this committee to help out and with any, actions going forward. And we're willing to help out by putting out videos. We usually do videos every Thursday about 3 p.m. We send them out. So if there's any ideas about what exact kind of communication we need to get across, I think I'm more than happy to see if we can find a way to put it in, and we can tailor in Jennifer and everybody to help us out with it.
Well, and I like the idea of utilizing neighbors and customers too, because it's a little bit more personal to those people. And if we can convince them, then they can be of great help to convince the companies themselves. Plus also, Jim, was there any kind of reasoning, thinking back to the chart that you showed us about the percentages of different categories, was there any reason why rental agencies was so low?
It's so included in that category were rental agencies and property management companies.
Yes.
And we've got a lot of property management companies.
Okay.
Most of the large rental companies are on board. So your Pam Harringtons, your Akers Ellis, your Poston and Co. Those are on board. But there's a lot of smaller ones out there that we haven't been able to get on board. So that's another arena where potentially this subcommittee or this, if it ends up being a joint task force and, could assist. And I'll tell you, I've talked to a lot of folks on this issue and had a few conversations with folks out in California who've been dealing with this problem for, decades. And, their advice is, number one, it's a very difficult issue. But the communities that have had the most success out there, it has been through a grassroots, a creation of a non-profit, pesticide-free Malibu is one example, but, it's where a community comes together and says, no, we don't want these products in our community. And then they take whatever steps are necessary, to try to get them out of the community. And so, while the town and conservancy are pushing it hard as we can, I think the other avenue that would be helpful is a community effort, driven by the community as opposed to entities and governing bodies. And then I guess, I didn't touch on this, and I don't know if we talked about it. We probably didn't because a fair amount has changed, I guess. But, obviously the issue here at Kiowa has gotten a lot of press, right? Every local TV station has covered it, local papers, the state in Columbia as well, and Charlotte Observer, and it's become news, and folks are taking heed. And so, we've had inquiries and conversations with Senator Chip Campson on this issue. He's very interested in it, as well as Spencer Whitmore, who recently was elected to the House district, our House district, as well as some others. Even the governor's office is apparently aware and has reached out to DNR. And I think that's one of the reasons why DNR is now a partner in this research project. So,
Yeah.
In
the new wildlife, yes, there's a huge article in the new South Carolina Wildlife. If you get that magazine, there is a lot about the problem with the SGAs and Jim and Kiowa's thing. So if you don't get this magazine, I highly recommend it, because this is the second time they have, in not too distant past, that they've had articles about our bobcats there. So.
Yeah, very true. And then, not only on the, political side, but also, from a number of conservation groups, within the state have also embraced this issue. So, you've got the Coastal Conservation League, who started a petition, which has somewhere close to 1,500 signatures at this point. They're partnering with a number of other groups, trying to bring about change at the state level. But because of the Kiowa issue, right? I mean, it has shown the light on this problem that is certainly happening in other communities. They're just not aware of it. And so, we'll see how those efforts go, which are, effectively independent of the town or any Kiowa entity, but nevertheless inspired by, what we've learned here and what we're doing here.
So Jim, I just want to make an observation, potential recommendation. So it seems like with what we're hearing from California is this is going to potentially be an ongoing issue, and it kind of mirrors similarly to what we're seeing with things like the mosquito misters and that sort of thing. Would we want to have a subcommittee that has a little bit larger focus and scope, like a pesticide subcommittee, so that we can keep the folks together to help out with some other pesticide issues on the island?
I think that's a good idea. Did I hear you correctly? You just volunteered to chair this?
Yes, that's what I heard, Jim.
Task force? That's what I heard.
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful.
All right, so Lee is officially the chairman of the Kiowa Pesticide Task Force Subcommittee.
Wonderful.
With a focus on anticoagulant rodenticides and others.
Great.
Which I think is a good fit, because obviously the Conservancy has done a fair amount of background on, the mosquito misters as well as the anticoagulant problem. if we can turn it into kind of a larger group or a group working together, or two groups working together and in parallel, then hopefully we'll have a bigger impact.
And unfortunately, it affected our bobcats, but fortunately, because so many on the island love the bobcats, I think we can pull in a much larger support system for this whole thing. If it had affected raccoons, I'm not sure how much interest there'd be, but,
Armadillos.
That's true.
or armadillos, yeah. Has there been any thought, Jim, to bringing in additional bobcats to the community?
So sure, yeah. I mean that has been discussed, from day one, and it's not something we would like to have to do, for a lot of reasons. Number one, it would be expensive. Number two, it might not work because
What's the downside, Jim?
if you put a bobcat here, go catch one on John's Island or somewhere else in the coastal plain and put it here, it's going to want to go home. It's probably not going to stay here. So there may be some ways around that. They've had some success with other animals, and holding them in captivity in the location for a little while before release. But then you're talking about, a super expensive project. So, the biggest problem we have right now is that our mortality rate for bobcats is, this year it's 75%, and we don't have any reproduction. And that's pretty much tied directly to the anticoagulant problem. So the hope would be if you do solve that problem, that fewer cats will die and we'll start getting some reproduction, and that our numbers will rebound.
But Jim, you still have a gene pool issue, right?
Potentially. Yes, we do. And that's one concern that I've expressed a number of times, which is, the issue of a genetic bottleneck. And so, we already know that Kiowa's population genetically is what you would call it's a partially isolated population. So there's not free-flowing genetics between Kiowa and the mainland. And so because of that, you've already got a population that's not very genetically diverse. And then you decrease the size of that population, your genetic diversity gets even lower. And so, we don't know yet, but potentially, if you get to the point where you're down to a handful of individuals, then their offspring would likely be so interrelated that their survivability would not be as high, and their likelihood of surviving long-term may not be high. So not something, it's something you can look at with genetics, so we'll just continue to monitor that, but it's certainly a concern. Yes. Anything else on this issue? All right, so we'll move to the last item under new business, which is Lee's going to tell you about the Kiowa Conservancy funding proposals for our current fiscal year, which began July 1st. And so, he's got a couple of projects he's going to briefly talk about, and I think everyone should have received the proposals on Friday, and I don't know if anything's changed, Lee, after your discussions this morning. But yeah, I'll just let you take it away, and then hopefully some folks will have questions, comments, or suggestions for you.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so those proposals, they went through the executive committee this morning and everything looks good. So one of the things that I guess I'll give a kind of a preface for everything. We proposed the groundwater and marsh projects last year with the potential for them to go on to a second phase. And it seems like through a strong recommendation from Mayor Weaver that we should continue doing these projects and look into them a little bit more, especially with the ponds and looking at how they relate to groundwater table heights. And so what we're doing with these proposals is continuing these projects into phase 2 to gather more information about these habitat types and to kind of learn more about these conditions so that we can potentially move into more environmentally friendly practices on the island. So for the groundwater project, what we're doing is we're proposing for the continuation of the monitoring efforts so that we can establish a long-term monitoring effort. We're looking also into the relationship between the ponds and the groundwater table height. And then we're looking into doing some basic chemical analysis of the groundwater to look at what's influencing the electrical conductivity and salinity in the waters, as well as potentially look into some additional chemical compounds that we might find in there. I mentioned in a few meetings before that whenever we dug wells out near Arrowhead, that we found kind of like the sweet tea looking water. So it'd be good to have a good clue about what's in there, what's potentially contributing to its coloration, so that we can have a better idea about how the hydrology on the island works. And the idea is that we can eventually come up with a water budget for the island using this information, taking in the information from the tide level gauges and the some climatic factors such as rainfall and evapotranspiration, that sort of thing. So that would move us into a better idea of what our groundwater conditions are on the island and kind of establish a long-term monitoring effort for groundwater. And for the marsh project, we're looking into getting more detailed technical information about the current status of the marshes. So what we're looking at from the phase 1 part of the project was looking at the changes in the shoreline over time. With the projects that we had this past year, we looked at the time between 1977, roughly right when it was starting to be developed, to current days, which is about a 42-year time span. And with this information, we're able to see how the marshes have changed over time so that we can identify some potential problem areas. But what has been mentioned before and has been looked at by DNR is the potential for restoration projects that are put into the marshes to not be successful. And one of the things we want to do is make sure they are successful, because whenever we put these in, we want to make sure that the funds are used well and we have the right designs for the needs of that area. In 2019, consequently, right after we proposed the projects to the town, DNR released a living shorelines report, and in that they listed out specific characteristics to look into for putting in specific designs for restoration projects. And within this phase 2 part of the marsh project, we would be taking those into consideration and finding areas that would work for specific types of designs. And we would have a good idea of what these areas would be with phase 1 projects. And then we'd be able to see how we could implement restoration projects with the phase 2 part. And that's currently our thinking on these proposals. So we would get more detailed information about groundwater characteristics and the status of our marshes, and be able to go forward with some potentially good preservation and restoration projects.
When do you think the first written reports of the data analysis will be in for both of these projects? You know, not just progress reports, but actually some data being analyzed.
Yes. So when we first put in the preliminary report in June, we had some basic analysis of this, but it wasn't as detailed because we've only captured between, I think, mid-April to about the end of May. Once we get the information in from the level loggers now, we'd be able to kind of get a better idea of what it looks like throughout this year. With these potential projects being continued into next year, we could potentially see that a more thorough investigation of the groundwater be completed, and we would have a full seasonal database of these groundwater conditions sometime around April to May next year. But for some preliminary analysis and understanding between the summer months and the fall months, we could potentially have something in November or December.
Yeah, I'm not trying to rush that because it takes time to collect the data and then evaluate it and write something up. I'm just curious and want to be sure that there are some, strong reports that will be coming sometime in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with interim reports being released every now and then, it kind of keeps up with project status and gives everybody an understanding, at least our progression of understanding of the groundwater conditions here, so that we can have some exchange of ideas if something potentially comes up and we want to look into specific conditions over something else. So yeah, that's a good point.
And what are your long-term plans for continuing the monitoring? Because 1 year of data doesn't mean too much.
Yeah.
Do you have plans for long-term monitoring?
Yes, we do. So the level loggers we have now would be able to be used after the college sort of kind of leaves the project and kind of hands it to us. And what we're planning on doing is creating a framework that would be able to take all that information in and being able to churn it out and kind of make it digestible to the greater community. And part of this is to develop that framework in order to basically put it into a map on a website where we can all look at it. And I think that will kind of develop over time. But the idea is that we would go out, 1, 2, 3 months, out of the year, gather that information and deploy them back out. So it would be like a steady progression of this information over time. There is potential for it to be live information if we get telemetry systems, but it would just depend on the funding and the level of information we want.
Well, with something like the shoreline change with the marsh study, before we start looking at places to develop for living shorelines, I'm sure you're planning on a major analysis of how shorelines have changed over the period of time that is being looked at, where are the hot spots for change that are occurring, where would be areas that are accreting, in order to, really evaluate it so you can talk about where to look for potential management.
Yeah, absolutely. And the phase 1 projects is a good way to prioritize those areas. So what they're doing now is they're sort of cleaning up the shorelines. They've been completed, but what they need to do is they need to go through it and make sure they edit it correctly in order to run it through amber analysis. And what this does is it takes the shorelines. So if you have shorelines like this over time, it can actually take it and quantify it perpendicularly to the other shorelines so you can see that change over time. And if you flip on and off some of the maps in the web map, you can actually see that change. But quantifying that is the issue, and that's what the amber analysis will be doing. And we can use that information to prioritize specific areas that have lost more marsh compared to areas that are experiencing maybe marginal losses of marshes. So yeah, it's mostly about prioritization and giving the information necessary to make those right decisions, not just putting them out. But yes, it's a good point.
A good looking map, good looking analysis, what I've seen of it so far.
Yeah, I think so too. And the map actually has the most current NAPE imagery. So I think the NAPE imagery was from around September, if I remember correctly. And it's very colorful and very informational, I think.
Lee, are you looking for causes as you go through this, or is it mostly a mitigation sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we have a good potentially good idea of what's causing this, but most of it is towards mitigation and trying to fix what's already, what damage has already been done. But whether or not it's a specific factor or another is up to question. Potentially, if we get information from this tidal gauge that's been put on the Kiowa River Bridge, we can see if there's been changes to sea level rise trends over time, which could explain some losses of marshes out in the West End Marsh. But yes, I think that's something that could also be looked into as well.
You'll have to identify the hot spots of where erosion has been occurring, and then, you know, try to extrapolate from that what might be some of the causes in those locations, I guess.
Yeah.
Because you don't have other data about ongoing activity over the last 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
And it likely could be where we look at elevation models from one year compared to the next. Using the baseline 2017 elevation model from DNR, we can take models from years past and see how it might have changed over time, and seeing if that net change matches what sea level rise trends look like.
so there were 4 data sets in the map that I saw. Now, did you say you were going back farther and adding 3 more?
Yes.
70s?
Yeah, so there's currently 9. It's 1977 is the earliest that they've had, and I think it's a LiDAR imagery from about that time. And then I think those are just the 4 marshes, 4 shorelines that they wanted to put in that showed the most drastic changes. And then the other ones are sort of kind of, they're not as needed because they're kind of just marginally changing a little bit. But those are the ones that they chose to put in there. But yeah, there are 9 shorelines and 5 more total, with some additional kind of peppered in there.
You would also be looking at particular time periods, probably when there were more rapid changes than others, and asking whether or not it's increasing, the rate of erosion is increasing in more recent times. You could probably correlate some of it with major storms, depending on the timing of those things. So, there's a lot of, really getting down into analyzing it to be done. Be fun.
I believe so too. And from my basic look at it, it seems like the period between about 1999 and 2011 was where we see a lot of drastic changes. And it'd be interesting to see how, why is that, and maybe how could it have been caused.
Lee, maybe just switching back to groundwater briefly. Have people hypothesized or practically done anything to remediate the loss of a freshwater bubble on a barrier island? Or is this ground that, if we find we're losing the freshwater bubble, what do we do? Have people hypothesized or actually done anything ever?
When we went to the college to work on the projects following, the committee approving it back in November, we asked Tim Callahan and Norm Levine about this, and there's not really that much information about it. These types of studies haven't been proliferated throughout the southeastern United States and looking at barrier islands. But there's probably some instances where it's happened somewhere else, maybe further inland. But for the most part, groundwater studies, they haven't been as densely populated on barrier islands before, and especially looking at ponds, because it's a very it's a distinct type of community that isn't found pretty much everywhere. The only other place I could think of, like Hilton Head, maybe have the amount of ponds that would be studied the same as Kiowa. But for the most part, we just have an idea of what groundwater recharge looks like. And looking at some of the USGS kind of notifications, or the publications they send out, there's only a good idea of what it looks like based on the soil structure and that sort of thing. So this is really kind of like a trailblazing kind of project, and we're just trying to figure out where might we find something that's similar, that's written somewhere else, that we might be able to tailor into these sort of projects, and what would mirror the best for what groundwater conditions kind of fluctuate, like in Kiowa.
Yeah, so it's not as simple as pumping water into the ponds and having the freshwater bubble come back to life or anything.
It could be, and it also could be putting in some pretty simple things like, and I think this has come up before, but rain gardens, where you would just have an area that just collects rainwater and allows it to go straight into the groundwater table. And I think that sort of thing will allow that recharge to be a little bit more, expedient. And also kind of solve a little bit of some of the flooding issues we may see in the coastal region. So it could be a wide variety of mitigation tactics that we can use, not just, within the ponds, but also within our community, neighborhoods and that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Please, to see where the groundwater is coming from, how much is coming from some ponds versus just soaking down from rain. Ultraviolet.
Can you repeat that? I think you.
Colorless and non-toxic, and they're used for groundwater tracing studies widely everywhere. Could be something interesting, down the road in response to Jim's question.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's probably something we can bring forward to Tim Callahan. I know he's done similar things in the past. He was mentioning some of the groundwater aquifers that are on Kiowa and how we have traced them back 2 to 3 years in the past where, aquifers 700 foot underneath the ground are showing signs of things that happened 2 or 3 years ago. It'd be good to see how we might be able to do that in a subsurface aquifer instead of something 700 foot deep. But yeah, I think that would be something to ask him.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions for Lee? We all agree these are pretty good projects.
Yep.
Good things to continue.
Yes.
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 Yeah.
Yes.
Yep, I agree. Thanks, Lee. All right, so we'll move on to reports. Let's see, I will start. I can find it. Let's see. All right, so I've just got a quick update on a few projects. So the alligator research study, this is the joint Clemson-Nemours study. That study is wrapping up field work. The final session of field work, these behavior surveys, will take place in October. And then the graduate student will then be focused on analyzing all of the data, putting together her dissertation to include recommendations, conclusions, and all that stuff. So that'll be done in October, but then it'll be probably another year before we see the final report, if you will. I think I touched on all this already, but just, real quick on the Bobcat GPS study. This past winter we caught four bobcats. We put collars on all 4. 3 out of the 4 have died already. So that's a 75% mortality rate so far this year. The first death was May 19th, an adult male that died from anticoagulant poisoning. Bobcat 600 died on June 10th from anticoagulant poisoning. And then Bobcat 250, who's actually the 1-year-old female offspring of Bobcat 600. She was hit by a car on August 11th on Governors near the preserve. And while, it's pretty clear that the car is what killed this cat, we still sent it to the lab to look at anticoagulant levels, as well as to do a full necropsy to look at, potentially other things. We don't have the results back from that bobcat yet. So we've got one female out there with a collar at this point. We will have 6 collars on hand to deploy in 2021. I hope we can catch a few bobcats. I honestly don't know how that's going to go. But if we do, we plan to to collect blood samples again, just like we did this past winter, to try to gather a little bit more data on, SGA prevalence, in our bobcats, even though blood is not a great indicator. If we're seeing positives in any of the cats we catch this year, then, we know that SGAs are still being actively used.
Jim, do the home ranges of the cats that have died and been analyzed, do they give you any indication of where in the island the poisons might be more concentrated?
Good
Yeah,
question.
it's a great question, and something I have looked into. One thing is that, with our high mortality rates, and our dropping population, the home range sizes of our cats have increased pretty substantially. So for example, the adult male 550 that died in May, he was pretty much roaming from one end of the island to the other during the months that we had him collared. The female in the preserve, she actually had an interesting home range. She lived in the preserve primarily, but also, well, not primarily. She pretty much split her time between the preserve and the Flyway Dunes. She traveled back and forth between those two areas quite frequently, but still roaming over a pretty large area. And if you look back to the cat that died last year, again, the home range sizes are so big that, obviously we know that anticoagulants, SGAs, were being used somewhere within that home range, but it's hard to pinpoint, exactly. The one from last fall, she lived primarily on the western end of the island, utilized Captain Sam's spit quite a bit, as well as, most of the west end of the island up until probably the first fire station. My guess is that while residential properties certainly have a lot of SGA use, we found out about a number of regimes in recent months that had been using SGAs, some in the windswept area. Obviously a facility like that, if they're utilizing it, they're going to be utilizing a lot more volume than a single residential home. I can't really answer your question specifically other than to say home range sizes are bigger. We've got some guesses on where this stuff is more prevalent than others, but we don't know 100%, obviously. So moving to painted buntings, I know Aaron's talked about this in the past. He's kind of got two projects going on with painted buntings and has had for a couple of years. The first is the use of nano tags. Typically, he's been placing those on birds in the late summer or fall, and they basically look at short-term movements of these birds. The batteries don't last that long, but they're good at picking up. I think initially Aaron was looking at where they go to molt before they migrate south. And this year is, these nano tags are going out a little later with the hopes of figuring out migration timing. When do they leave? How quickly, do they travel south? And hopefully where they end up. Because there's a pretty good, so these nano tags basically are picked up by MODIS towers that have been erected all down the southeastern coast and throughout the country. And so, we can certainly pick those birds up here with our towers, but the hope is that we'll also get some data from other towers on where they go. So we do have a new tower on the top of the timbers, which due to its height, due to the elevation and its location at kind of a bottleneck on the island, is a great location to pick up these birds as they move south. It's also very well suited for obviously picking up nanotags from other researchers. And because of where it is, any bird that flies by along the coast on the beach, passes over Kiowa is going to get picked up by that tower. So it'll be interesting to see, what sort of data we get. So Aaron has 34 of those nanotags to put out. 18 are out so far, and that should get wrapped up this week. And then in terms of geolocators, which is the other project, so geolocators last for a longer period of time. They give you, less precise informational location, but are really good at figuring out, did a bird winter in Florida, Cuba, or South America? And so to get data from those, you've got to recover the animals in future years. And so this year, the geolocator work, whereas in the past it's focused on adult males, this year most of the geolocators went on adult females. So kind of gathering some different data on females to see, their migration timing and where they go in the winter. And then the last study I wanted to update you on is the fall migration banding. This is something the town has been doing for many years. We started August 15th of this year. We've got 6 banding assistants who are employed to assist with banding at 2 study sites, one at Captain Sam's Spit and the other on Little Bear. And that work will continue every day through November 30th, weather permitting. And I just threw a few, the updated statistics as of yesterday. So at this point, 951 birds banded, 257 recaptures representing 42 different species. We're really at the start of the season and really haven't had our first, I guess we had a little cold front this weekend, but not a lot of migratory movement yet, but things will pick up here in the next couple of weeks. Anybody have any questions, comments on any of that? Okay, we'll move to Community Association report. Matt, you have anything?
No new updates.
Fair enough. How about the resort, Liz?
Nothing new here.
All right, ARB.
Hi, nothing new with us either.
Right. How about the Conservancy? Y'all have covered everything you have? Jane, we can't hear you.
Yes, I think so. We spent a lot of time on the rodenticides this morning and the position statement and voting on those. And also we have to approve these projects. So Lee, do you have anything else you would say?
No, one thing, one quick question. So I know that, Mayor Weaver has mentioned that he would like to have these kind of go forth before he leaves office. Did we want to go ahead and to vote on those today so that he'd be able to look at them officially, or how did y'all want to go about it?
Yeah, so there's no reason for the committee to take a vote. Either way, it's not a requirement. And I hadn't planned on doing that today. We certainly can, but it won't. The consensus is the committee thinks the projects are good projects. And I haven't heard anyone say differently. So that will be the message that's conveyed. That the money is budgeted, and assuming, and because these projects are effectively continuations of existing projects, it's a little bit simpler this year, I think.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Sure. All right, last is Lynn, Turtle Patrol.
Well, we're done. Nesting season ended August 15th with our last naturally laid nest, and then we had several wild nests. It appears as though we had 345 nests nests this year, but the reality is it's really only 342. We had 2 wild nests that turned out to just be eggshells brought up from from 2 previously inventoried nests. And then we had a nest that was out in the bird sanctuary that, trying to honor Aaron's request, we did not spend a lot of time probing or locating the nest. We just based it on the length of the crawl and felt that the turtle had been in there long enough to have done something. So we quickly staked it, got a GPS and got out of there. Well, Pam tried to do the inventory on it and dug pretty considerable size area, she said, and couldn't find the nest. So whether there was in fact one there or not, I don't know. And then we had another strange thing. I called Charlotte on this because I wasn't even sure. I don't think it's ever happened before, but we thought we found a nest in zone 3 because there were 2 hatchlings there in a hole. So I dug and dug and dug until it narrowed to obviously a crab hole. So these 2 hatchlings had fallen into a crab hole, but they were still alive. And I called Charlotte saying, we have looked for 45 minutes. We cannot find another spot. We've dug everywhere that potentially looks like it could be a spot. And she said, record the nest anyway. We just won't be able to have a specimen for that particular nest. But she said, you saw the 2 live turtles, so you know there's a nest there somewhere. Well, as I was speaking with her, a 3rd hatchling walked out of the rack. So we got those 3 hatchlings out to the ocean, and they were pretty strong little guys. But they were strange things that just haven't happened before. And I guess it kind of goes along with this crummy COVID year. But there have been some good things that came out of it. We had to put some different practices into effect for our nesting season because we were so limited. If you remember, it started out where only the driver could be in the truck alone and do all the work by themselves. We were able, after a couple of weeks, to add a 2nd person into the truck by sitting diagonally in the back seat from the driver. But we added a 3rd by having walking patrollers who are experienced probers probing within each zone. And Charlotte is absolutely correct. Walking the beach is the best way to find the nests as opposed to looking down from the truck. And it was a huge success. And I believe even all of the folks that I've heard from that were part of that probing program have all asked that it be continued. And personally, I feel as though it should be as well. Regardless, I know we don't know what we're going to be dealing with next year, but either way, it was that helpful to have the probers on the ground walking the zones. So other than that, we're just waiting. We're almost done with hatching season. I think we've got maybe less than a quarter of the nests left. So it's all gone pretty well. And even the data entry, Jim, has not been a huge chore.
That's good. I got a reprieve this year.
You did, but it worked out well. Less trips to town hall, less shuffling of cards everywhere. But all in all, the season was a good season. Numbers of nest wise. Our quality of our nests, however, as far as I'm concerned, are not as good as they've been in previous years. And there is so far not one thing that we can point to as to why that is. We're hoping the genetic testing might show us something. We don't know. But many of the nests that were poor quality had 0 hatches whatsoever. And of course, we didn't find that out till the 70-day evaluation. And no wonder they didn't see any tracks because no eggs hatched. So no emergences took place. And then we had others that were maybe washed over once or twice, but that's not a lot of washover. And they were messy, wet, reminiscent of the black egg year. So very strange issues this year. But it was a successful year. And we had a lot of patrollers participate, and thank God we did, because they were really the backbone of the whole program. We couldn't have done it if many of them were afraid to get out there doing this data collection work due to COVID. So although we couldn't have any newbies join us, we had a huge core of regulars that took part in the program this year. So that was another great outcome from it too.
Well, great. Well,
That's
thank
it.
you, Lynn.
Okay.
Citizens' comments, none. Chairman's comments, none. Anybody on the committee have anything else? Any comments?
This is Jack. I wanted to ask you about the armadillo issue. I saw something on my Kiwa. Somebody thought it was really cute to see an armadillo on the. And I'm not so sure I'd put in that category. What's up with the armadillo issue?
Yeah, we have armadillos now. You know, more than we had last year, and in terms of damage or problems with armadillos, I'm not aware of any. You know, I've had armadillos in my backyard in West Ashley for 12 years. They dig in the grass from time to time to eat grubs, get in the flower bed and eat grubs. I've never had any issues. And I know that there's a perception that they're bad, and certainly they can cause damage. They can burrow under foundations. They can, you know, forage on golf courses and cause problems. But I haven't received any complaints about damage from armadillos. And the few folks that have had them, you know, either burrowing near their home or steps, while they've expressed concerns, it doesn't seem to be an issue. Has anyone seen anything different than that?
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. With that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Okay. Bye.
All right. Thank y'all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Bye.